and welcome to another Sacred Wisdom podcast. In today's episode, we are going to discuss Tartaria and the Underworld. Now, in Greek mythology, Tartarus was always referred to where god Zeus sent the Titans, the giants, or anybody that betrayed him. But this is a fascinating part of history, which is always classed as mythology. But we believe there's a lot more to this subject than when you start actually looking into it and the connections to it, to all these different other parts of history. And I am joined with the wonderful Stephen Denman today. Welcome, Steve. How are you?
I'm well, and hope all's good with you.
Very good, brother. Look, let's start with, there's a lot on this subject, so it goes very deep and obviously can get very confusing for people. So let's just start with the Underworld and the history and the Greek mythology part of Tartarus and Tartary.
Okay, so if we go back to this, really just imagining going back many aeons of time to Greek mythology, somewhere in that historical timeline, many of those stories from Greek mythology were based on actual real historical events. So if we go back into the generations of the massive landmass known as Great Tartaria, which came to prominence in northern Russia, we have to remember the expanse of Great Tartaria was so huge that it had a massive cultural and scientific level of influence over many other countries and nations. If we look at the Greek myths concerning the civilization of Hyperborea, which existed in the Arctic North Polar region, and how that civilization eventually faced demise, and the arising of the civilization of the Scythians that became eventually Scythia Major and Scythia Minor, which mainly was centered around obviously southern Russia and northern Ukraine, and also in parts of Eastern Europe, to the development and the arising of Great Tartaria. We had to understand this expanse, this landmass was so huge that it went all the way across, reaching up to the Caspian Sea, into Western China, northern India, and Eastern Persia. Wow. And so there was a lot of intercultural exchange, a lot of different understanding was going on. When we come to the connections between Great Tartaria and the Greek myth of Tartarus, which actually translates to frightful place, we have to take into account all of those other countries, those different geographic locations that I've just discussed, because they were part of the overall cultural influence that was coming from the Tartarian kings, the Tartarian queens of northern Russia. When it comes to Greek mythology, myths arise from stories. Stories arise from rumors arise from historical facts. So over many generations, you get distortion, you get cultural misinterpretation taking place. So you imagine over a span of 500 years, 1,000 years, 1,500, 2,000 years of history, of warfare, of conflict, civilizations rising and falling. Eventually, the linguistic morphing that takes place and the historical distortions that take place ultimately end up with symbolic conceptual concepts and ideas. And this is what obviously has happened with Greek mythology.
So you feel Tartarus was actually, and I feel that it was actually a real place at one stage, right?
Well, the actual understanding is below Great Tartaria, especially if you look at the polar Urals and the northern Urals in north central Russia, there are known to be huge passageways that literally interlace below that vast region. And they're purported in Sami folklore or Laplander folklore and Turkic folklore to literally reach down or course into the hollow earth below that area of northern Russia, right out into the reaches below the Arctic North Polar region. So whether it is in the Kola Peninsula, the Murmansk Oblast of northwestern Russia, going right the way across to the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug of north central Russia, which is obviously where the polar Urals and the northern Urals are located, and all the way across to the Kamchatka Peninsula in the Russian Far East and Siberia, there is numerous stories from the various different human beings living in those areas concerning passageways that go down deep into the Hollow Earth, and they're connected to the various stories and legends of the white giants who were said to have descended into the Hollow Earth to escape the catastrophes and the major upheavals that were taking place. And obviously, we remember that we had the first mud flood, the second mud flood, and the third mud flood, but they were far more contemporary in terms of historical timelines. But obviously, going much further back, as we've discussed in a previous Sacred Wisdom podcast, we've talked about the massive atmospheric and climatic upheavals that took place, including massive volcanic activity across, northern Russia, and obviously in parts of Southeast Asia, that caused major problems with agricultural collapse or farming collapse, which meant there wasn't enough fruits, vegetables, and cereal crops that could be harvested. And so obviously there was large migration, movements of populations, and, going back to the Greek myths concerning Hyperborea, we know about these Cyclopean giants that were also known as the Hyperborean giants that existed in and around the Riphaean Mountains being the polar Urals and the northern Urals of the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug of north-central Russia.
Do you think the Cyclopses were actual real beings, or were they genetically made?
Well, they were real beings and they were possibly genetically adapted, but I do believe in the antediluvian world, that is the world before the first great flood and the second great flood, if you for want of better phrases, I would say that the Cyclopses, or shall we say the Cyclopean giants, were most definitely real enormous humanoids that did walk across the land masses of planet Earth. I think they were vast in size, maybe reaching anything from 25 to 30, maybe from 35 to 40 feet in height. These were absolutely huge bipedal life forms. So I think
you think they actually saw in a different way, having the eye in obviously their third eye. Do you think it was they had a completely different perception than we do?
I think, yeah, I do. And I think, again, there's been a lot of historical distortion and deliberate historical revisionism, but not by those that are part of an alliance of good, but shall we say by the elites and secret societies. And I'm not just talking about the elites and secret societies here in the 21st century. I'm talking about over the last 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years and more of history. There's always been secret societies working alongside kings and queens and princes and nobles and so forth.
Quite funny that people think there isn't, really.
Yeah. So the situation when it comes to the Cyclopean giants is, I don't think they were these mad, psychotic, highly violent individuals that are portrayed, for example, in Greek mythology. Again, we have to remember myths come from stories come from rumors come originally from some kind of factual situation or situations that arose in some historical timeline that was so powerful, was so profound, was so dramatic. They had a lasting effect on the human consciousness of millions of the individuals that either observed them or were related to people who had directly observed them during those periods of history on planet Earth. So definitely real. And I think they did have different perceptions of the 3D holographic reality that we define as the material dimension because of where their single eye was located, which would also indicate it was in a different kind of alignment in terms of its electromagnetic resonance with the pineal gland, which is also interesting to note. Yes, absolutely.
So where was Tartarus in mythology? Let's just go from the mythology and the official story. Where was Tartarus located?
Okay, in Greek mythology, Tartaros, or the frightful place, was believed to be below any area really in mainland Greece and across the Greek islands where you had dormant volcanoes. Okay, so what appeared to be mountainous locations. So it was so vast that it could be accessed through any one of those locations across mainland Greece or across the Greek islands.
So Tartarus was referred to as the Underworld in Greek mythology, right?
It became associated with the Underworld, and you have to remember that the brother of Zeus Olymbos was Hades Olymbos, and his actual name became the definition of Tartarus, or the frightful place, in Greek mythology. If you actually understand that in many of the stories from Greek folklore, they referred to the Titanes, which is the vengeful beings, or the Titans, as being the Lefkoi Gigantus, which meant the white giants, the Lefkoi Gigantus, or the white giants. And we have to understand also that in Russian folklore, there are many stories, especially from northern Russia, that referred to the Beli Velikani, or the white giants, that were also defined as the Tatarsky Velikani, or the mighty giants, because the word Tartaria obviously is a Latin word, but Tartary itself means mighty, it can mean strong, it can mean powerful. So these Beli Velikani, or white giants, that were also known as the Tatarsky Velikani, or the mighty giants, inhabited the polar Urals and the northern Urals of north central Russia. So many of the Turkic peoples also, within their own folklore, have numerous stories concerning these white giants that frequented the polar Urals and the northern Urals of the Yamalo-Nenets Autonomous Okrug of north central Russia. And they referred to them as the Sogliuk Beduka, or the pallid giants, or in a very similar way, they referred to them as the Sogiluk Beduka, or pallid giants. Very, very similar wording, but not exactly the same. And they apparently, in the stories, were always understood to be descending into or ascending out of entrances into some murky, shall we say, Ural Mountains-based underworld that we could possibly sort of theorize. And again, I'm just speculating here that possible entrances into the Hollow Earth.
Yeah. Well, there are plenty of entrances into the Hollow Earth around the world. A lot of people
absolutely
only have to look at South America and what the explorers have found down there, potholers and lots of interesting caverns and inner worlds almost that people have found, and illuminated light inside as you go further into the Earth as well. A lot of people keep very quiet about, but there is actually algae and various plant life that can emit light, isn't there?
It is. It's interesting that when we look again at the Greek mythology and we look at the story of Tartarus, or the frightful place, it was described as being very dismal in terms of there being a lack of any luminosity. So that's an interesting contrast to the idea of bioluminescence from these very algae, I think it is, in the actual quartz crystalline veins of many of the rock faces that are known to be very commonplace within the passages that go down into the Hollow Earth.
But some of the crystal structures as well that have been discovered are quite unbelievable, actually. Some of the quartz caves that, these complete caverns of quartz crystal.
That's right.
It's completely surreal. It seems like a fantasy world.
If we take the idea that there is these white giants that were 12 to 14 feet high, you can imagine them descending down in these ancient passages, perhaps that some of which were constructed in the antediluvian period, and literally going into areas 2.5 kilometers to maybe 3.0 kilometers or more below the surface of planet Earth, looking around across these vast caverns, luminous, beautiful, radiant, and full of all these different amethyst crystals, or prasiolite, which is green quartz. You just imagine, with all the different bioluminescence of the algae, in all these quartz crystal veins, and the light sparkling would have been quite incredible. I mean, just visualizing that is quite amazing. It's.
Do you think these cave networks would have been built by ancient civilizations?
But some of them are natural, but some of them were deliberately or intentionally interconnected, I would say, with artificial tunnels or passages, and these were access tunnels for transportation purposes. And I think that these white giants, they took with them much of the occult technology of Great Tartaria and in northern Russia, and descended into the Hollow Earth, because I do believe they were very psychic and telepathic, and I think they sensed there was a great or shall we say, an immense change coming on the surface of planet Earth. And a creeping malevolence was taking over, and they would not be welcome on the surface of planet Earth for much longer. They would be seen as outsiders on a genetic and biological level. and in some way the elites and secret societies would want them removed from the populations of human beings, especially alongside the eradication of Great Tartaria as, actually being accepted as a long-term civilization in northern Russia. So their only choice was to either descend into the Hollow Earth, or if they had the capability, which they didn't, was to actually have some kind of aeronautic or astronautic based occult technology to literally leave planet Earth behind and literally travel out into the solar system. So the only choice they had was to descend into the Hollow Earth.
Well, it's very practical to think that in the solar system we live in and all the asteroids flying around, that actually living in an inner Earth makes more sense than living to some level on the outside. Obviously, people will argue that and say, well, there's no light, but that's arguable as well, in the sense of when you start looking into this subject, which we'll probably come on to a bit later, but there is apparently a central sun as well inside the Hollow Earth as well, or some sort of light, emitting light, some sort of energy vortex,
an
or
electromagnetic or plasmic ball of energy of some nature. And that's created from I believe, from the mixture of the various chemical gases that exist within the Hollow Earth and the various crystalline-based rock minerals that interact, creating different kinds of electrical effects that have built up over thousands and thousands of years within the Hollow Earth. And obviously the internal gravitational field, because it is technically centrifugal in its impulse and nature, for want of a better word, so that's how it's able to be created as a spherical or ball-shaped plasmic energetic field, basically, that radiates luminosity. And we know that the wavelengths of luminosity, in terms of Native American folklore, when they've actually discussed sending their own, brothers and sisters down there on explorations underneath the United States of America and parts of Canada, the way that the actual luminosity interacts with the human body means that it's impossible for there to be shadows within the Hollow Earth because of the central sun or the inner sun. It's just simply because of the way, the actual waveforms of photons actually move around because of the gravitational field there.
Isn't that interesting? Like on the surface, we can create the shadow. I look at it symbolically, like, we create the shadow on the surface, but in the underworld, there's no shadow. Psychologically, I find that quite interesting as a metaphor, that we have the shadow on the planet. It's like we have the duality on the surface.
That's right.
In the inner Earth, there's no duality. It's all one.
But when we take a look, for example, back into Greek mythology and this sort of almost fixated idea that everything below the surface of planet Earth, or everything below the surface of mainland Greece and the Greek islands, was Tartarus, so this frightful place. And eventually the namesake of Hades Olympus became used as the meaning of what Tartarus, or the frightful place, was. And the actual etymology of Hades itself means unseen place or invisible place. So again, you have this idea of darkness, of lack of visibility. Now, I think that lends one to believe in this idea that Tartarus could have been seen almost as the Middle Earth, not actually as the Hollow Earth, but the initial tunnels and chasms and cavernous openings that exist within, so we say, the Middle Earth, between the surface of planet Earth before you reach the openings that come out into the vast internal expanse of the Hollow Earth itself, where you have the inner sun or the central sun. So, there's so much world folklore that describes the idea of hell or the underworld being full of various, freakish monsters, including, all the different kinds of bipedal creatures such as goblins and trolls and orcs and all other, and you just think of all these, and then obviously the legends of serpents and dragons, most of whom are described as living, deep underground in passageways or cavernous openings. And it's that in itself is very interesting, not just archetypally, but the idea that there's these, which is interesting to note as well, that they're all kind of reptilian
Yeah.
life forms. So, all the things, whether it was goblins, trolls, and orcs, were all described as being partly reptilian. They had certain features that were part reptilian, part mammal. And then you have a look at, obviously, serpents and dragons, and we're all told that these are fictional reptilian life forms that have never existed.
Yeah.
I would say that they did exist in ancient history, and actually, that's information we can discuss in another Sacred Wisdom podcast, perhaps. But the connections into the Hollow Earth idea and also the underworld are very much, shall we say, interlinked with these different kind of life forms, not just the white giants that purportedly descended from the surface of the polar Urals and the northern Urals in the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous Okrug in north-central Russia for reasons of personal safety.
Well, you have the story, the famous story, which I'm sure some people will know about, and that's Olaf Jansen and his father that traveled, the two Norwegian fishermen that actually traveled up, and by the current, apparently they got taken up into the North Pole polar region and actually went into the Hollow Earth. They actually spent 2 years within the Hollow Earth, apparently. And then when they returned, the father unfortunately died, but Olaf Jansen was there to tell the tale. He was actually put into a mental asylum.
That's right.
For believing what he saw. And what he experienced. On his deathbed, he actually told the story. Yeah, and he got Willius Emerson, who wrote the story of Olaf Jansen. But there are many stories like this around the world. There are many stories of potholers, people going into caves and finding tunnel networks, even in Britain alone. But yeah, an account of a guy that went into a Yorkshire mine and actually found green illuminated light when he went into a certain distance. So there is definitely something happening inside our Earth. So what level that is, we don't know. But all these connections to mythology and all this makes sense that there is something living inside our Earth or inhabited inside our Earth.
That's right. Yeah. And perhaps that the white giants, these 12 to 14 foot high, white giants, from whether they're from northern Russia, perhaps many of them actually are genetically related to the Cyclopean giants or the Hyperborean giants of the Arctic North Polar region, and obviously which included countries that we know today as Greenland and Iceland, and also the landmass of Spitsbergen, and obviously the vast expanse of northern Russia.
Yeah.
So there perhaps is many other different life forms that are down there. Perhaps, even the idea that certain species of dinosaur may have descended, in the various subterranean rivers and estuarine areas into the Hollow Earth. The whole idea of the Loch Ness monster, appearing up there in the Scottish Highlands in that beautiful and vast Loch Ness is actually based on the idea that it actually disappears because there's subterranean aquatic passageways that lead out into the North Atlantic Ocean. From there, some of them lead out into the Norwegian Sea and up into the Arctic Ocean. So if we again, interesting in the Greek mythology, though, when you look at, for example, the Theogonia, which mean deity's birth, that was written and published by 702 BC by the Greek poet known as Hesiodus Kyriakou. He goes into talking about Tartarus, describing it as one of the earliest, shall we say, subterranean expanses that was created in the divine creation, alongside what is known today as chaos, which means gaping space, Gaia, which is earth, and Eros, which means love. So we know that Tartarus, or the frightful place, was seen as being immensely ancient and prehistoric in its actual existence. We have to also then remember that Tartaros was the location that, according to the Socratic dialogue defined as the Gorgias, which it translates to fierce, published by the Greek philosopher called Aristocles Aristonou, who most people know today as Plato Aristos. He says that he was saying within that actual dialogue, he was stating that soul personalities who were judged after death and were seen as wicked or malevolent or evil were punished by being sent by Hades Olympos into Tartaros, or the frightful place. So there's a connection there between the idea of soul personalities, which are beyond, linear space-time, that are enshrined inside the biological form of each human being on planet Earth, alongside the white giants, that have also been defined as the Titans, who were also cast into Tartarus, the frightful place.
Mm.
Does that then lead to the shall we say supposition or speculation on the idea that these white giants may have had genetics and DNA that vibrated at a different frequency to the genetics and DNA of Homo sapiens or human beings? Again, I'm just putting that out there, sheer speculation, but it's interesting that connection that this is coming from, obviously, Greek mythology. It's coming from the Socratic dialogue known as the Gorgias or Phaeus of 405 BC, that was published by the Greek philosopher known as Plato Aristos. Just putting it out there for thought, because it kind of gives you the idea that maybe the hollow earth, in terms of the laws of physics, is not exactly what we might perceive it to be. That in the
Or
hollow
maybe
earth,
this whole world is not what we perceive it to
yeah,
be.
yeah, and everything from what we perceive the moon that is purportedly orbiting planet Earth is really all about. But that, again,
Well,
that's a huge
just with
subject in
that, I mean,
itself.
so people get an idea, we've explored the moon more than we've explored inside our oceans and the
That's
deepest
right.
beds of our ocean. So there's so many things under that ocean.
If we take a look at the idea of what's in the North Atlantic Ocean, the South Atlantic Ocean, what's in the Indian Ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and so on and so on and so on, if marine archaeologists had the funding, had the grants, from various colleges and
Yep.
universities around planet Earth, to spend years and years trawling, alongside perhaps the US Navy, the Royal Navy here in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, and all the different shall we say military forces around planet Earth, in a coordinated effort to say, right, let's do this, let's
That'll
try
be
and
a day.
really you know really spend a lot of time looking at buried or concealed artifacts in the sediment of the various aquatic environments of planet Earth. Again, it would completely reshape the
Yeah.
entire view of Western science when it comes to what we have accepted as conventional history. And we also know that, for example, in the Mediterranean basin, is just a side note to that if you look at Greek mythology, that many of the cities where these so-called hybrids, such as the Minotaurs, the Centaurs, the Satyrs, lived, were actually in cities that were in what at the time was the Mediterranean Valley, which then was literally inundated by, obviously, the waters of the North Atlantic Ocean through the Straits of Gibraltar. And all
Wow.
of those cities were destroyed, and it was believed that it was at least 125 to 127 prehistoric cities there. So again, none of that's talked about. You don't see huge expeditions or excursions going on with marine archaeologists in coordination with, say, the Greek government or the Turkish government, or or any individual is looking to finance this who might be, a wealthy business person or entrepreneur. And yet again, if that was done, they would find so many anomalies there in terms of artifacts and relics that would really bring into question the official version of the consensus history we have, which isn't really true history at all. It's actually completely falsified, or it's only partially true. So it when he comes back to looking at the idea of the white giants, from the polar Urals and the northern Urals, that existed as the Tartarian giants within that incredible civilization of Great Tartaria in northern Russia, what you're looking at is, again, another conduit into, shall we say, challenging the officialdom of Western science when it comes to accepting what is conventional history as opposed to true history, or shall we say falsified history that's made to seem realistic or authentic, and it's then repeated over and over in schools, colleges, and universities, in the United Kingdom of Great Britain, across Western Europe, and across the United States of America and Canada, and I'd say Australia and New Zealand especially. But when you go into actually the various countries like Argentina and Chile, Uruguay, Paraguay, perhaps even Brazil, in South America is one example. They're a lot more open-minded, just as they are, in the schools, colleges, and universities of the Russian Federation, as well as in countries like Kazakhstan and many other locations, to actually challenging the officialdom that's been built and developed around the idea of accepting that the falsified version of history has to be given as the only version of history, and we have to believe that these white giants never existed, that great Tartaria never existed, when nothing could be further from the truth. And obviously then it's all just designed it's presented to us as, oh, this is just another conspiracy theory, just like the hollow earth is a conspiracy theory, UFOs are a conspiracy theory, and it just goes on and on and on. It's so internecine, it becomes so overtly intricate and overly complex, and it's because there's this constant covert battle going on to try and win over human consciousness.
Yeah,
and that's really what it's to do with.
Yeah, and people were been so primed to believe in their history and understand it like the way it's being presented, that it's very hard. I do understand that way of thinking, that it's very difficult to adapt or change, but you've got to start with the base of history and understand that even that itself is still a theory, just as science is still a theory. This is working things out, and this is what part of the reason why we do these podcasts is to bring this information alive. So people talk about it, discuss it. We have to be open to debate. The reason why is our planet is in a very serious situation if we don't go forward with truth. If we don't push and have open discussions like this with information, we're not going to a good place. So this has to go through. And I do believe, me and Stephen do feel that this will be out in the open eventually, all this information.
In stages. I don't think it's all going to happen at once. It will be, because it's too overwhelming, as you know,
I agree.
Zach. As many of the viewers know, it's far too overwhelming for the majority of human beings on planet Earth to be given, literally, by chapter and verse, every single revelation that's been covered up and just seen and poo-pooed and just sidelined as just another silly conspiracy theory. Suddenly there's real evidence, there's the documentation, there's the individuals in the academic world of Western science finally admitting that, yes, there has been these huge cover-ups, as with the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., when it comes to the skeletons of the huge giants, the white giants of the United States of America and Canada, and the concealing of those huge skeletons, just as they found the skeletons of the little people that were well known to Native American tribes, such as the Cherokee Indians, is just one example. So we know that this is going to have to take place at some point. There has to be an unfolding, an unwinding of all this concealment. And I think when you look at the idea of disclosure of, yes, we are being visited, have been for many thousands of years, by ultra-terrestrials and extraterrestrials, and many of those shimmering metallic discs that you see flying by themselves are in sequence, those orange orbs, and the oval-shaped, white, glowing, luminous objects that you see in the night sky. They're all real. They're nothing to do with the military-industrial complex or the MIC. They are piloted by real ultra-terrestrials. That, I think, is going to be, in some sense, that disclosure, that may be the first real positive step towards letting, other, shall we say, conspiracy theories come to the surface and actually be given real scientific consideration, and allowing the general public to have that information in stages, I think, is very important. And we have to understand, when we look at Greek mythology, we look at the Titans. You've got to remember there were two very specific stories from Greek mythology. So you have the Titanomachia, which was because the word Titan,
the War of the Titans, wasn't it?
Yes, I mean, it is. Titanomachia means War of the Titans, but the etymology of the word Titanes, okay, in the singular, and Titanoi in the plural, itself means vengeful being or vengeful beings. So these huge, enormous bipedal life forms that were anything from 150 to 175, 200, maybe 225 feet or more in size, vast, battled the Olympians under the father of the gods, Zeus Olymbos, were then cast down into Tartarus, and so when you then look back to the
I mean,
time
it
of
wouldn't have been easy to get them in there.
yeah, but we don't know what kind of occult technology. For example, the lightning bolt that Zeus had, was that really some kind of laser weaponry?
Yeah.
Was it some kind of compact, highly efficient telluric electricity absorbing device that could discharge huge voltage of electricity to cause, I don't know, damage, or it could actually immobilize these huge titans, and literally they then were transported into the underworld. Again, when we look at the white giants or the Tatarski Valakani, or the mighty giants of Great Tartaria and northern Russia, was that a reworking of earlier events that went on many aeons ago? When perhaps the Hyperborean giants descended into the hollow earth. Was it the case that they were really cast down? Was there a battle with these Greek deities or not? We don't know. Perhaps there was. Maybe there were human beings that had advanced occult technology that maybe in Hyperborea there could have been some, and again, this is sheer speculation, some kind of huge amount of conflict that arose in the polar Urals and the northern Urals of north central Russia. Again, we haven't got any proof to that effect, but there has to be some grain of truth somewhere in that Greek myth. And perhaps it's the case that some of the human populations in other countries on planet Earth saw the white giants, that were known as the Cyclopean giants or the Hyperborean giants from the Arctic North Polar region as a tremendous threat to their own existences, and they were terrified of them. Very possible. They wanted to cast them down. They wanted to literally put them in, in terms of building and construction processes, where is the largest natural containment area that you could put these vast beings? Think about it. The only place, of course,
bury them.
Well, you had to put them underground into large geological openings or cavernous openings, and then block them in, so that and by doing that, they would have no choice. If that's what happened, again, this is speculation, they would have no choice but to then redevelop a new kind of civilization in these subterranean reaches that went down into the hollow earth. And they took with them much of their own, the cymatic-based occult technology, the anti-gravity-based occult technology. And if you're using cymatic-based occult technology, they're probably going to be able to literally slice or cut through solid rock, including obviously granite and other hard mineral stone, to actually construct their vast edifices and eventually these beautiful crystallic cityscapes and urban environments of the hollow earth. So I think there's some truth in the Greek mythology concerning the Titans and the giants. And obviously it's
given so much significance, the Greek mythology. So it's like the Bible. It's got there's an importance to it. It wouldn't be so prevalent in society. And so, everywhere we are, we always hear about Greek mythology in Hollywood films and all this stuff. It's always referred to. So there is something there, and also as well, if you look at films over the last 10, 15 years, particularly, they are really aimed at the mythological subjects that we're talking about.
Yeah. So if we go back to looking at these Cyclopean giants or shall we say the Hyperborean giants, there seemed to have been some kind of relationship where they acted in a guardian type of role to the Nordic Hyperboreans that lived in the land of the midnight sun, up in the Arctic North Polar regions and obviously along the coastal areas of northern Russia. So, and obviously they must have had what appeared to be, these shining pyramids or crystal pyramids constructed not just in the more lower lying areas of northern Russia, but obviously up in the polar Urals and the northern Urals of the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous Okrug of north central Russia. where the atmospheric conditions would have been very different. The oxygen levels would have perhaps been a lot purer, but because it was a milder climate thousands and thousands of years ago, it would have been possible, therefore, theoretically, to grow fruits, vegetables, and cereal crops. And, we know that there's been many cases of enormous looking fruits, vegetables, and cereal crops that have been able to be grown in the faraway north. There's a lot of actual stories from Turkic folklore and also Sami folklore or Laplander folklore concerning that. So,
well, I mean, it just made me think of a place in Scotland called Findhorn, which they've had enormous fruit and veg grown up there. They explain it to be because there's a nuclear plant nearby, but it could be today. But this is a cold condition up there. I mean, this is top of Scotland near the Hebrides Islands. So this is very remote, and you doesn't get warm. But I would imagine there's some sort of electroculture going on there, or some sort of crystalline structures underneath the earth that's giving it more energy for these plants to grow. But Findhorn, and a very magical area as well. There's a lot of interesting bipedal creatures that have been sighted in Findhorn, and all types of mythical creatures. So maybe this runs in parallel with the whole kind of ley lines, that there's some crossover of ley lines where these creatures or these things appear, which we
could possibly
about a little bit in the cryptids episode.
That's right. There could be some interdimensional, trans-dimensional aspect to this, where literally the intersection of one or more of these geomagnetic ley lines would allow a dimensional portal to open. And again, this is just speculation, but with the kind of occult technology that the Nordic Tartarians had, when we look at what they were able to do, is it too much to say? But I don't think it is. We can definitely speculate and say, were they able to open dimensional portals? They understood about the importance of building many of their edifices. They're incredibly elegant looking and ornate, stately homes and palaces on geomagnetic leylands. They had that knowledge. They had that understanding and discernment concerning that. So you take that to the next level. Were they really in any level of awareness concerning the more subtle electromagnetic aspects to the geomagnetic ley lines that would allow for the opening of one or more dimensional portals?
I think it was inbuilt. It was inbuilt into their civilization, so they were brought up with this stuff. A lot of people will look at that and think, "Oh, how can I create a portal in front of me?" It doesn't work like that. They understood the grid of the earth. And there will 100% be certain points. I know from my own experience, and Stephen knows this, certain points in stone circles that will cross over, and you'll feel the energy in these circles. You'll feel certain points by the kingstone of a circle, for example, which is normally the stone which is plotted outside, actually at the top of the stone circle, which is the energy point.
That's right.
So it's all there. So if you understood this, it would be something that you could work with, and you could possibly create some sort of portal or something in front of you. Yeah, makes sense.
It does. And it's interesting to note that many, shall we say, megalithic standing stones have been found by Russian archaeologists, along the coastlines of the Barents Sea, the White Sea, the Kara Sea, the Laptev Sea, the East Siberian Sea, and the Chukchi Sea.
Wow.
And, so were they originally constructed, those megalithic standing stones, along those coastal regions in northern Russia, as part of the civilization of Hyperborea, to access dimensional portals, by using the electromagnetic resonances of these geomagnetic ley lines intersecting with each other. And so if we then just again speculate that if there had been lots of communities there of these Nordic Hyperboreans, would it not be the case that they would have actually observed on numerous occasions over thousands of years, many generations of time, these Cyclopean giants or Hyperborean giants roaming around along those coastal regions of the Barents Sea, the White Sea, the Kara Sea, the Laptev Sea, the East Siberian Sea, and the Chukchi Sea? Now, is it the case that many of these Cyclopean giants or Hyperborean giants were able to reach these coastal locations because they knew where these entrances into the Hollow Earth were in the polar Urals and the northern Urals, and were able to descend into those? And is this also why there's obviously stories of white giants by many of the indigenous inhabitants, such as the Sami or the Laplanders, when it comes to the location known as the Yamal Peninsula and the Arctic Russian island chain of Novaya Zemlya. Now, again, we
Wow.
don't
Okay.
know exactly what was going on, thousands of years ago there, but it's interesting that so many of these different indigenous groupings of human beings, not just in the Kola Peninsula of the Murmansk Oblast of northwestern Russia, all those from around the polar Urals and the northern Urals of the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous Okrug of north central Russia, and even the different tribal groupings or communities that exist out in the Kamchatka Peninsula of the Russian Far East and Siberia, as well as all the different Turkic tribes of Central Asia and other nearby locations. Always seem to have these stories of these white giants or the pallid giants, and their existences seem to be so elusive. They seem to appear, they seem to disappear. Well, how can beings that are 12 foot to 14 foot high or even larger just, suddenly appear and disappear? Perhaps there was differences in their genetics and DNA.
Yeah, it makes sense. And maybe they could even attune to these ley lines and frequencies and almost
Yeah,
transport
exactly.
themselves. Who knows? Like
Yeah,
we're
again,
just
it's
throwing ideas out there
but then
and
again, we look at the Sasquatch as a good parallel to this. We know the Sasquatch or the Bigfoot is
yeah.
believed, this is being studies done by certain, shall we say, individuals in the United States of America and Canada who have come to the conclusion that the actual Sasquatches or the Bigfoot are super psychic and super telepathic,
Oh, yeah.
and are able to consciously shift the frequency and vibration of their own genetics and DNA, their own biological form, and can literally then transport themselves along these geomagnetic ley lines for hundreds of kilometers and reappear within seconds in a completely separate, remote, wooded or forested location somewhere else, either in the United States of America or Canada. So did these white giants or Tartarian giants, did they have this ability? Was that inherited from the Cyclopean giants or the Hyperborean giants of the Arctic North Polar region?
Yeah.
Again, I'm just putting that out there as a question.
Well, it makes sense when with Sasquatches. I mean, in the Yeti, it's almost like they can attune themselves to the environments they're in.
Yeah.
So they almost become camouflaged by the environments. Because I do believe this is the same being throughout. They're
Yeah.
not different types of Sasquatches, but they're able to mask themselves within the environments they're in. Obviously, again, because they probably don't want to go near humans. A lot of people seem to be very frightened of them. I would be, of course. I think anybody would be. But these beings, I believe, are very, they're like you're saying, Steve, they're astrally traveling through these dimensional portals or dimensional frequencies that they're able to go in and out of.
Yes, right. It is, and I think there's more than one aspect to these connections between the white giants and the Hollow Earth. The idea of the Titans and the giants being cast down into Tartarus by the Olympians under the father of the god Zeus Olymbos. And I think one of the most interesting historical facts that's very rarely talked about was a very serious, very widespread disaster that took place in the Siberian taiga forests that went through a number of wildfire stages over many aeons, and the luscious tree-lined canopies over vast areas were turned into charcoal. And one of the most serious levels of widespread devastation occurred on the 15th of August, 342 BC. It was so destructive that literally thousands and thousands of square kilometers of the Siberian taiga forests were completely destroyed. And this actual event led to the demise of the Scythian Empire. Now, we've talked in a previous Sacred Wisdom podcast that the Scythians, obviously, were the genetic inheritors of the remnants of the civilization of Hyperborea. And it's also interesting, as we've mentioned before, that there were amongst the Scythian Aryans beings that were described as white giants with bright red hair and bright red beards, many of whom would run alongside the actual cavalry as they were galloping along, and the horses were, racing across the Caspian steppes. So that's very interesting. So there was obviously some of these white giants had remained socially integrated, amongst the communities of the Scythian Aryans, hadn't descended into the Hollow Earth. But what is interesting around that time is that the actual visible devastation that had taken place in the Siberian taiga forests, there was so bad that everything was ashened, the sky full of smoke and fire and charcoal everywhere. And so from that date of the 15th of August 342 BC, what we see is there were major flaming disturbances because of these intense wildfires that heated the soil and gravel, which then caused deposits of anthracite, coal, and sulfur that exist in vast swathes below the Siberian taiga forest to burn and smolder across those vast expanses, creating a lot of, shall we say, visible glowing to take place within the actual bare ground itself. Wow. So it's interesting that date. And when you look at the stories from Greek mythology regarding Tartarus, again, this is speculation. Was it a reworking of the destruction or various phases of destruction that had taken place in the Siberian taiga forests? After all, we have to remember that the Riphaean Mountains in Greek mythology were actually officially, today we know them as the Polar Urals and the Northern Urals. So these Greek academics knew that the Riphaean Mountains were in the faraway north, obviously, which is northern Russia. So is it something that we can then also consider that and the actual endless wildfires that seem to have occurred in the past in the Siberian taiga forests, for whatever reason, whatever's going, it could have been volcanic activity, could have been electrical disturbances in the atmosphere, who knows what it actually was that was taking place, that these accounts of what was going on filtered through to mainland Greece, filtered through to the Greek islands. We know that there were many individual Greek scholars who were expert geographers and historians that widely traveled, into parts of Central Asia, into Eastern Europe. So there could have been a communication going on between many of those individuals and individuals they met in those various geographic locations. So
there's been artists that have explained this, one of which was Nicholas Rowick, and he was born 1874, died in 1947, that date again. But he did some fascinating symbolism in his paintings of northern Russia and the spiritual movements that was going on. So one of the statements he said while he was on his travels and he documented was that Great Shambhala is far beyond the ocean. It is the mighty heavenly domain. It has nothing to do with our earth. How and why do you earthly people take interest in it? Only in some places in the far north can you discern the resplendent rays of Shambhala. Now, Shambhala was always talked about in Tibetan culture as being the world within. Even the Dalai Lama talks about Shambhala as well as being this world within ourselves.
Yeah.
So this has always been referred to in Eastern culture, isn't it? The Shambhala. Yeah. So let's just talk about...
Well, the etymology of the word Sambala or Shambhala is from the Sanskrit language. It means peaceful place. So in terms of meditation, in terms of what Tenzin Gyatso, the Dalai Lama, might say is, yes, it's that, as the Lord Jesus Christ or Yeshua ben Yosef would say, it's the kingdom of heaven within you. But there is also from world folklore this consistent idea of these etheric, shimmering, crystalline cities of the subterranean reaches of the Hollow Earth that had existed for many thousands of years, but they literally resonate outside linear space-time. So only the initiated or those that are attuned through purification of their own genetics and DNA, their own spiritual development is also become highly advanced, would they be able to perceive, the actual expanse of Shambhala or the peaceful place within the Hollow Earth. So there's two aspects to that. So there is the internal meditational aspect of what Tenzin Gyatso, the Dalai Lama, is referring to. But you also have the external, or the, shall we say, the more esoterically based aspect, which is that it actually was an etheric expanse, and literally an etheric cityscape, vast in size, and just full of beautiful crystalline buildings, edifices, stately homes, palaces. But it's interesting to note there are actual connections between the idea of Sambala or Shambhala, the peaceful place, and actually some of the Turkic folklore from Central Asia in regards to that. So they actually talk of the Yalchuk Tenria, which is the light deities who dwelt in a very remote subterranean location. So it's interesting to note that even though Nikolai Konstantinovich Rerik, or Nicholas Roerich, obviously had this really fantastic understanding and discernment of Sambala or Shambhala, the peaceful place, it is also well known in many other cultures, especially in Turkic folklore across Central Asia. So, from some of the stories that have come from Turkic folklore, they talk of the Yalchuk Tenria, or the light deities. These are highly luminescent, etheric life forms that live within the hollow earth, which would then kind of suggest the idea that they're obviously not so corporeal or physicalized as human beings are. They apparently dwelt in the Sasirakev, I think that's how it's pronounced, the silent abode of the hollow earth. And so again, we have a connection between Sambala or Shambhala, the peaceful place, and this place they refer to as the Sasirakalev, or Sasira Likev, the silent abode. So there's a connection there. And the fact that from Turkic folklore, as I've already mentioned earlier on in this Sacred Wisdom podcast, they refer to these huge bipedal life forms as the pallid giants that were seen for many generations of time, roaming across the polar Urals and the northern Urals of the Yamal-Nenets Autonomous Okrug, and down into other parts, presumably of what is today the Russian Federation, and were observed by these various nomadic Turkic tribes. That in itself is very interesting. So, where does that all come from? How can so many different individuals from
just a Hollywood film, Steve, just came out of nowhere, But the guy I'd really like to talk about, who was the naturalist and ethographer, who was called Alexander Gustav von Schrenck.
Yeah.
He had a conversation with a lot of the Nenets and the Samoyed people, didn't he? And actually spoke about where they talked a lot about this stuff. So let's just talk about these guys for a while.
Well, the ethnographer known as Alexander Gustav von Schrenck, he did studies into the, shall we say, the Samoyed folklore concerning the polar Urals and the northern Urals. And he describes beings that were described to him as the Judeski Narod, or the foreign people, or the Judeski Layudi, the foreign people. But they were described as having very pale complexions, very bright blonde hair. Now, these may not have been, obviously, the white giants of Hyperborea, these Cyclopean giants or Hyperborean giants. They may have been actual colonies of the Nordic Hyperboreans themselves. So again, we don't have any real verification on that, but they actually had a relationship based on trade with the Nenets or the Samoyed. So they would actually descend from the polar Urals or the northern Urals. And were they emerging from entrances that went down into the underworld or the hollow earth? Again, that's speculation, but where were they disappearing up into when they went back up into the polar Urals and the northern Urals in that area of north central Russia? And it's believed that they would meet with the Nenets or the Samoyed, and they would request sheets of iron, which they needed for their own manufacturing processes. And in return for the metals trade with the Nenets or Samoyed in that area of north central Russia, these friendly Nordic Hyperboreans, if that's who they were, would then give such individuals various kinds of coats, scarves, and gloves that were made of thickly layered fur that had been tailored and sewn together in really quite expert ways. And they were very appreciative, because it kept them warm. So
it sounds so far out to people listening to this, but the only way we can really verify certain situations is probably archaeology, and obviously that's questionable sometimes as well, depending on who does it. But there has been some Russian archaeologists, hasn't there, Steve? So let's just talk about that, because what they've discovered is quite amazing, really.
Okay, so during the 25th of June 1928, the historian and archaeologist from Soviet Russia called Artemy Vladimirovich Artsikovsky was given a story by an individual called Kasavako Vilka and his son, who was called Serakon Vilka. And this was concerning beings that were known as the Grand People. And I presume that was referring again to these Nordic Tartarians that apparently resided in the polar Urals and the northern Urals. So, and apparently they would descend into what appeared to be luminous caverns via various concealed entrances in the most remote and therefore elusive locations in the polar Urals and the northern Urals. So, again, whether the historian and archaeologist from the Soviet Union that interviewed these people by the name of Artemy Vladimirovich Artsikovsky was given correct information or not by these individuals, I don't know. But it's again, it again reiterates that there's a lot that's obviously been going on over thousands of years in different locations across northern Russia that connects the white giants to the polar Urals, and the northern Urals, the Riphaean mountains of Greek mythology, connects it to Tartarus, the underworld, which could be really archetypally a sense of being representative of entrances that are initially very dark and gloomy, but after a few hundred meters go down into areas of bioluminescence that open up into the hollow earth.
Yeah. Yeah.
And again, and then we need to look at these connections between these various stories from the Nenettes or the Samoyed concerning the Nordic Hyperboreans and these white giants of the polar Urals and the northern Urals. Again, there must have been some kind of interrelationship. So going back to Greek mythology, looking at the actual stories of Hyperborea and the faraway north of the Riphaean Mountains, the land of the midnight sun, we have these individuals that live for hundreds of years. They have no diseases, no infections. There's no suffering. They live completely idyllic, harmonious lifestyles. It's a balmy, mild climate, and they are literally guarded around the base of the Riphaean Mountains by these Cyclopean giants or Hyperborean giants. So there must have been some kind of interrelationship, just as there was an interrelationship. A co-collaborative process was taking place between these Nordic Tartarians and the Tartarian giants that had existed in northern Russia. And I'm going to say this, I believe that Great Tartaria was the only civilization in more contemporary history, or in terms of the actual timeline of its development as a civilization, where that unique relationship had actually existed over many generations of time between these Nordic Tartarians and these Tartarian giants that can also be called white giants, that had very specific racial characteristics of, quite reddish or auburn hair and reddish or slightly orange looking beards. They're quite distinct in that way. So
hey, blown away. And the more you're talking about it, I'm just opened up to all these different ideas of what we're seeing in feature films and all this. People need to understand I'm a filmmaker. I've researched stuff. I look at this stuff. This inspires me. This is how films are made. So all the knowledge you see in contemporary films,
right, absolutely,
they're all pointing towards some sort of history, knowledge. They've come from somewhere. It's not just some airy-fairy concept that someone's just thought up. And when you understand the world we live in, frequency and thought, how it works, these are messages, information is floating all around us, and it's us that tune into it, and then we put it out there, like me and Stephen are doing these podcasts. So we will talk more about these subjects, and this is an in-depth subject, and Stephen's knowledge on this and facts and information is essential, because this needs to be placed properly, told properly to everybody. So we need to relay this in the best way we can. But Steve, is there anything else you'd like to add?
There is so much more I would like to add. This is such a vast subject that is really not talked about with any level of regularity in the, shall we say, the alternative media. I will say this, that if it is the case that the Cyclopean giants or the Hyperborean giants had actually descended into entrances down into the Hollow Earth below the polar Urals and the northern Urals, it is likely that they were very, very proficient by using their cymatic-based occult technology in mining huge quantities of gold, platinum, chalcopyrite or copper iron sulfide, nickel oxide, chromite or ferrous oxide and chromium oxide, and magnetite or ferric oxide, as well as the dark sediment known as anthracite coal. So again, there could be a connection there. Anthracite coal, the idea of gloomy subterranean reaches being mined out, where you've got all this sooty and dusty coal everywhere by these huge Cyclopean giants or Hyperborean giants that could have then eventually become known as the Titans and the giants of Greek mythology. And that's really all I've got to say, really, because it is so much more information we could discuss, and perhaps we could really put that in an additional Sacred Wisdom podcast.
Well, thank you, Stephen. It's always amazing. And you always, as I say, every time we talk, you open my mind more. Your knowledge is incredible, and I'm blown away. I have always looked at how this underworld exists as a symbolic form of us. And it's almost like it will only grow, that underworld, the more we deny our shadow, the more we deny who we are and what we are as history. And we have to understand history properly. As Stephen said, we don't disagree with all parts of history, but there are certainly parts that don't make sense and are very uncoherent. So all we're doing with these talks is really opening this up to you, to open discussion, so you can discuss it more and think about it more in other ways, other perspectives, and build that viewpoint so we can build a better, stronger future. Now, if anybody would like to purchase our book, it's available on Amazon in paperback and ebook. You can also purchase through my website. And thank you, my brother. It's been amazing. And it's a bye from me.
And it's goodbye from me.